We're going to make this lively because you've been such a wonderful audience. I also just want to say, everybody all day long has been saying thank you to those of us who came out from DC. And after the last panel and listening to, the economic truthing there and Chris's experiences working on, restructuring their buying, we learn way more coming out, than you will from us. I promise you that. Trade policy, you have to keep it real, and that's what I think we've had so far, and we're going to keep talking in that vein on this panel. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Melissa Kessler. Melissa is the Director for Strategic Relations at the U.S. Grains Council, which is based in Washington, D.C., and fundamentally is there to promote the global use of U.S. grains. Melissa, poor thing, is responsible for crisis response, so she's been very busy over the last couple of years for sure. But in terms of the long run, she also works with international and domestic partners to promote awareness of all of the Council's great programs and the importance of market development beyond trade agreements. She previously directed communications at the National Association for Wheat Growers. And then we have John Beghin, who is a very accomplished economist. You can look at his CV and see a very long list of widely cited publications. We're very fortunate that John joined UNL as the professor and Michael Yanney Chair of International Trade and Finance in the Department of Agriculture Economics and the Yeutter Institute of International Trade and Finance. John comes to us from NC State University and Iowa State University, so we're very pleased to have you here. All right, so the topic for this panel is FTAs, free trade agreements, and the shifting global competitive landscape. So we know we're going to talk a little bit about what the U.S. is doing, what kind of free trade agreements we're negotiating, and how are we situated versus other countries that are also out there negotiating trade agreements. So just to level set a little bit on the numbers, and don't quote me on this because I sometimes get it a little bit wrong, but you'll get the gist of it. If you look at their own government websites, the European Union has been at this for a very long time. So they have well over 70 different trade deals in place. Our partner to the south, Mexico, has 10 agreements, but with 45 countries. Japan, which started very late in the process of negotiating FTAs, has 18 agreements with 54 countries. Maybe we can add one more to the list. China, which also started fairly late, has 16 agreements in place with 25 trading partners. So what does the U.S. have? We are a party to 14 trade agreements with 20 of our trading partners. And again, maybe we can add Japan to the list now. So there are some implications for all of this. And I want to ask John and Melissa two questions to begin with. And I'll just throw it out there for both of you, and you can trade off here. But for Melissa, I want to understand, how does an organization like the Council develop its priorities for the FTAs that the U.S. should negotiate, offensively or defensively, and how do you communicate those priorities?
So first I'd like to just echo Andrea's comments that this has been a very educational day. We really appreciate being able to be a part of it, and I appreciate being able to be here and talk about market development, right? So we're talking about policy development, policy structures, and we're talking about the outcomes of trade. But in between those two pieces in an equation is market development, going out and really making sure that you have fulfilled all of the capacity needs and addressed all the constraints that stand in the way of trade, in this case of physical commodities. So to provide some background, the Council is one of, there's about 70 organizations like ours that we're export market development organizations. So we don't buy, we don't sell, but we work around the world with the support of funds from the U.S. Farm Bill and support, more importantly, from our members, especially checkoff organizations, several of whom are in here, Nebraska Corn, Nebraska Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau, and I'm sure many others, to go into markets and work with local customers or potential customers to figure out what it is that they need to be buying more of our products. So is that they don't have a sufficient animal ag industry, because we're working mostly on feed grains and ethanol. They don't have a sufficient animal ag industry, and that needs to be built up. Is that an issue of local government regulation that really needs to be fixed with the help of a civil society organization or an association, but they don't have an association? Is it a technical knowledge issue? So do they know how to do a feed formulation? Do they know how to use software that would help them figure out a feed formulation? Is it a logistics issue with a port or a contracting issue? Those are the types of things that our staff on the ground work to address. And so when we think about FTAs and policy making, especially new FTAs and what do we need in those, we go back to that question of constraints. In our markets around the world that we're targeting, what's standing in the way of trade, and can that be addressed through a negotiation of some kind? Or is it better addressed in some other forum? And some of that information comes from our members. We do have agribusiness members especially, but as well as farmers who go out and visit these markets and get very deeply involved in them. And some of that comes from our staff. A good example right now is our Southeast Asia staff. Our Southeast Asia director is a very dynamic person. And every time you talk to him, he says, I want to see trade agreements. I need trade agreements in my region, because he knows that will provide the basic preferences that will then allow him to go in and make a more compelling sale to the potential users of our products.
Right. Well, and so John, that's the perspective of an organization representing a very large sector, but as you look at it, you're looking across the entire U.S. economy. So when you look at the choices that the United States has made to negotiate or to not negotiate the same type of FTAs or number of FTAs as other countries, what do you see as the economic implications of that?
Well, I think I see, where the problem when you're in the last panel, a lot of things have already been said, so excuse the repetition to some extent, but I think we have three major development recently on free trade agreement. The first one is, has been mentioned, is the retreat in world leadership to lead trade integration with the belief that trade is beneficial in aggregate to the trading partners. The second one is the overly reliance on market access and the focus on market access, mostly exclusively. And the third one, which was not mentioned, so thank you for not mentioning before, I think is or at least they were not mentioned explicitly, is the use of arbitrary exemptions and compensation. So I have a little joke, not so joke, but I don't know if you remember the sad days in Argentina with Kirchnerism and the fact that trade was the enemy, and there was trading of import licenses or export rights, and so very ugly things happening. And so I think we're almost there in some aspects in the US. So for instance, you have Tim Cook, as President Trump calls him Tim Apple in his tweets. Tim Cook has been very persuasive, went to the White House and explained that, in a sense, taxing inputs that were going into iPhones were really just helping Samsung and Korean exports rather than US. And so got exemptions, in a sense, based on a personal persuasion. And Trump told him, basically call Jared Kushner. And so I think we're in Kushnerism, with the risk of Kushnerism, to paraphrase the Kirchnerism of Argentina. So the use of arbitrary exemptions. So lots of companies, I think there are 15,000 plus requests for exemptions, and so that's also creating opportunities for favoritism instead of having the rule of law. So I think that's also an aspect that's bad. In terms of the dynamics, I think the news is also very bad. So we in a sense we have lost competitiveness because other countries have taken the leadership, like the EU or the TPP that took place. And so world integration through mega deals or mega regional agreements is taking place. And so in a sense, we missed the train. And so we missed that aspect. And so there are dynamic elements also on FDI following that. For instance, I think Japan has invested a fair amount in the US, including in Nebraska, to secure supply chains and make sure the food safety is to their liking. And so that was also with the belief that the US was going to integrate the TPP. So you can see now Australians or European benefiting from Japanese FDI because in a sense we had that shift in competitiveness, and so it makes more sense to import the meat from Australia. And so those are the concerning, I think, implications of what's happening now.
Excellent. So you mentioned the mega FTAs. Can you explain that a little bit more, what the trend is now?
So in economics, if you took international trade in 1950s, the big debate was trade diversion versus trade creation. And so it was that the fact that when you had a trade agreement or regional trade agreement, you would, in a sense, block access to your market from more competitive suppliers because you had, say, a custom union or a trade agreement between less competitive parties. And so that concern was real and legitimate in the 1950s or 60s, but now, by and large, we're in a world where we have very low tariffs already through the 7 or 8 rounds of the GATT and WTO. And so that possibility, so a lot of competitive discipline has already been imposed on the planet, so to speak. So everybody has been, to some extent, put to the discipline of more integrated world market. And so, and then as you have larger sets of countries, see the EU now is 27 or 28. We'll see in a few weeks countries, large, $18 trillion. So you think of a TTIP, it's a $20 trillion US economy meeting 18 trillion 28 EU 28, and so that's a mega deal in a sense, right? And so the same for TPP, very large. The TPP pre-exit by the Trump administration, that was also extremely large and a way to create trade rather than diverting trade because it's such a large share of the U.S., of global economic activity. So.
Yeah, precisely. One of the, just to back up a little bit too, which we've talked a lot about the evolution of the WTO and some of the, the current impasse in negotiations. And one of the implications of that, sort of the acknowledgement in 2008 that the talks had really broken down, was that many countries almost immediately announced new FTA negotiations. And that may be well and good, but there are many, many countries that are on the outside, especially developing countries on the outside of all of these negotiations. So what happens to their market access when they are not part of FTA negotiations? But most of these new negotiations that have been described or launched are extremely large. So if the US and the EU were to negotiate, what do you think are the economic implications for the participants, but also for the countries that are not part of that deal?
Yeah, see, in the case of the EU-US, so for EU had everything but arms agreements that passed in the early 2000, and the US had I can't remember the exact acronym, AGOA or something like that. The US equivalent to everything but arms agreement at the EU. So the everything but arms agreement basically put zero tariffs on all exports from a series of fairly poor countries, many African countries, to the EU. Of course, they still had many barriers like phytosanitary regulations that were hard to meet or technical barriers to trade. And so in that sense, already those countries have had privileged access as long as they can meet standards to those markets. And I think in the US, to some extent as well, we have opened our borders as long, at least in terms of market access, it has been there. Now, if you see the EU-US, it would be a fantastic deal. So not to be anti-ag, but ag is great. Ag exports for the US are really important, 140 or around those numbers, $1 billion. But service trade is $700 billion plus, right? And so you look at the EU, we export about $250 billion of service exports to the EU, and we have a net balance of trade about $60 billion with the EU. So great possibilities already, and so that's before an agreement is in place. So you can see the potential for further gains by basically having common rules on services. That will be one implication. The ag is really a difficult one. So we have that has been mentioned before in the discussion. So we have, in a sense, we have a mix of protectionism, high farm subsidies in both. We're both guilty of subsidizing our agriculture extensively, say through subsidized crop insurance or area payments in Europe and so forth. So we have a lot of ag distortion where we need to agree on how to rationalize those. We have this disagreement on cultural disagreement on SPS measures. So food in the US and food in Europe are two different things. I've been straddling those, and so and of course you have a mix of that with good old protectionism, like in dairy industries, with tariff weight quotas, and so solving the ag puzzle between the U.S. and EU is definitely a challenge. But there are tremendous gains there also, and so you look at studies by Joe Francois and other people who have done studies for the EU Commission in Europe. And the gains for both countries are about 0.5% of the GDP for both. So is this a lot? 0.5% doesn't sound like big, but in the US that's $100 billion. That's the economy of Nebraska. So is it worth adding economic activity of the size of the economy of Nebraska? I think yes, right? And so that's for both. So that's my take on the gains.
Okay, so those are the economic gains. So we have that dangling in front of us, but from your perspective, representing the commodity groups, what is the feasibility here of addressing some of the thorniest issues that we've had over the years with Europe on ag trade?
Well, I think we'll see. One that I did not hear necessarily come up is biotech synchronization, right? Like we have different regulatory systems and thoughts on that. And that's something we'll have to work through, but there are two very large markets, and especially the grain side of things, but when you get into kind of the specialty pieces, specialty crops, as well as the cheeses and the wines and all the things that were talked about on the prior panel, there's a lot to be gained there. And certainly, having deals between these large economies would have impacts on other, especially as certain issues are resolved, if they can be resolved, that impacts other economies because they're looking to us in part for leadership. And that's a lot of what our FTA conversation is about.
Biofuel, for instance. So I've done some studies a few years back. And so biofuel would be one market where the U.S. could really export goods and gain, for instance. And so that would be a better way than trying to, push mandates or fight the way we're fighting now for ethanol. So.
Certainly, we can help the EU fulfill its own mandates.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So how about new markets? So Europe has been, Europe is an old market for us, and hopefully we'll get more market access there as a result of some negotiations. But there are many countries around the world where they're experiencing urbanization, income growth, diversification of diet, and they are small, but they are new and emerging and promising in terms of growth for U.S. agriculture exports. And how do you view those markets in terms of prospects for free trade agreements or other types of engagement with them?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to have heard the day's conversation because there was talk about diversification and talk about, how does U.S. agriculture proceed, right? And in the feed grain sector, we were perhaps not lucky in that we had to start looking at that question before even the last few years for various issues. And distillers grains, for example, we ran into issues with China, early in the decade. And the nature of that was, pretty much an example of, what was being discussed before. If you take out a big market player, you've got to find new markets, right? And my organization was charged directly with doing that, going out and building new markets, finding new markets, and frankly, directly making sales to existing markets for distillers grains. And we mostly, I have this great chart that unfortunately I don't have here, but you mostly see a pie chart of like big dominant players and then like every color of the rainbow, right? Because so many different countries have come in, and the volumes stay, around the same range, but the value didn't, right? And that shows the impact of these kind of disruptions is multivariate, and you have to look at a couple different pieces to really determine the impact. It's not just about volumes, it's not just about value, and it's a short and long-term question also, right? So ag trade, just like agriculture in general, and frankly I think trade in general, is a long game. So if you want to be in a market in a big way in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, you've got to get the right pieces in place now so you can go in and then develop that. It's not a one-year thing for the most part. And that's how we differentiate marketing versus market development, right? If there's a disruption or something happens in the market, for instance, China had, long story short, sorghum was not going into China all of a sudden. Beginning of the trade war. It was lots of fun. And it's like, okay, where's the sorghum gonna go? And it truly is, finding new markets in that moment for boats on the water. And that's a part of what we do, and that's a part of what we've been doing a good bit of for the last several years. But really the work is in the long-term picture. Right? So if we get access to a trade agreement or even just find a market we see has kind of fundamental demand based on population, income, and other factors, how do we go in and build that knowing that in 10 years we want that to be a stable market? So, in the 1960s, Japan was not a mature market, and now, it's a mature market. And we sometimes talk about how you went from North Asia to kind of North Africa and parts of the Western Hemisphere, and now the untapped places are Southeast Asia and other parts of Africa. And so we're really focusing a lot of energy in those places, hoping that, trade policy allows that, it makes that easier, but also knowing there are some fundamental market pieces that are going to exist regardless of trade policy. And if we can keep the disruptions out of the way, there's good chance to success there just because there's a lot of people and they are fortunately growing in income and therefore they want better quality food.
So it sounds like a lot of what you're describing in terms of market development has a lot to do with standards harmonization and working cooperatively in those areas. And in that sense, that kind of work would go hand in hand with some of the provisions of trade agreements that really address sort of process points, best practices in terms of developing those provisions and implementing them. And I want to ask John, because you talked a lot about this and we were talking earlier about the deeper integration benefits of doing FTAs. We've talked a lot today about tariffs, but FTAs obviously cover a wide swath of provisions, including those non-tariff barriers and investment provisions, procurement provisions, and all of those things. So can you speak a little bit more about the deeper integration aspects?
So the way trade economists think of the world is that you want to move from place A to place B, you have to cross a border, and you're going to have risk and cost along the way to do that, right? And so those trade agreements, you can think of those trade agreements as being de-risking, a de-risking exercise to kind of reduce all that uncertainty along the supply chain or the movement of goods. So of course, market access is one of the trade costs or the so-called trade costs we face with tariffs and TRQs, but also you have custom procedures, those were mentioned, you have transportation, and there are many distortions in transportation. We're actually part of you think of the Jones Act being one of the elements, for instance, and so you have a host of dimensions to so-called trade integration or thinking of de-risking and reduce the uncertainty all along the way when you move those goods or those investment flows. And so you look at trade agreements, typically they're going to have anything between 25 and say 30 chapters, and almost all of those chapters are, you can think of them as being reducing some of those trade costs, be on so-called trade facilitation, so you want to reduce the burden at passing borders in terms of the documents that you can do online versus waiting to get 20 stamps on your custom documents and things like that. And so the overemphasis on market access is really, in a sense, missing the boat on deeper integration that comes from reducing all those other sources of inefficiencies in the supply line. So.
Well, and maybe this is a good moment also to let's dive a little bit deeper and use USMCA as an example, because there are upsides and downsides to doing FTAs, right? They're trade creating, they're also trade diverting. You're changing trade patterns, And there are countries on the inside of the agreement, there are countries on the outside of the agreement. So there's a lot of upside and downside. But one of the advantages of negotiating FTAs is that you can really innovate and tailor provisions. And USMCA is a good example of that, particularly in the SPS area. So maybe, Melissa, you could describe some of the innovations there and what you can do inside an FTA in that regard.
Right, so I think there's this conversation about what do you do, from our perspective, what do you do to develop a market with an FTA or without an FTA? But if you go into, okay, we have an agreement, it's not just about tariffs. And I think we do get distracted by that, and it's kind of the very easily quantifiable thing. But USMCA is a good example. So before NAFTA, the setup was such that there wasn't a lot of room to build sales, right? And and there are economic factors and everything else, but NAFTA really opened that door, and now there are logistical advantages that make the U.S. the obvious choice for feed grains in our case. And as Mexico grows, that will continue to be the case. I mean, our logistics are integrated. So when we come to, that's been the kind of development story over the last couple of decades. You come to USMCA and, from a tariff perspective, certainly, thinking about just corn, we had tariff access, right? Like we've sold Mexico more corn every year for like the last 5 years because their animal agriculture industry is growing, right? We heard earlier they have more FTAs than any other country in the world. Certainly their economy is booming. They're a great location for investment for a lot of reasons. And we have unit trains that go like straight down. So we're not going to get anything from tariff access. We already have that. So what else is there in there? And it turns out it's actually a good deal for us because it has provisions about what if we have a dispute? What if there's a challenge? We're moving physical commodity, a lot of it. So if there's a problem, where's that going to go? It costs money to store that. It costs money to try to resolve these questions. The faster that can happen, the clearer it is what that process is going to be and who needs to be involved and how they get involved and the standards for that, the better it is for everybody involved. That's an efficiency. There's also, it has the first biotech chapter of any trade agreement. So we know that once USMCA is in place, fingers crossed, that will be the foundation and the platform for future negotiations. And having a biotech chapter for an industry that, has realized a lot of gains from modern breeding techniques is very important. These are things, again, they're not tariffs. They're not saying this is how much less it's going to cost you, but there's a cost factor built into that, and there's an efficiency to it. It makes things easier. It makes us able to work together better, and it then, over time, integrates us more, which is a good.
Yeah, just to add to that, for instance, the US and Mexico have virtually the same maximum residual limit on most pesticides and vet drugs, for instance. And so that's another example of harmonization that was achieved. So.
Yeah, it's one of the most boring but important areas of trade policy.
I find it fascinating.
It's regulatory cooperation, but it's incredibly important, absolutely.
But I do think, in 2017, it was funny because we brought a team of Mexican grain buyers here to Nebraska in 2017, so I was thinking about that earlier in the day. I don't think people realized until we started having a conversation about NAFTA and renegotiating NAFTA or opening it or whatever we were going to do with it, how integrated we really are. I mean, there are cattle crossings between the US and Mexico. They open a gate and the cattle go through. There are potentially more cattle that go across some days, than humans. We have built that over time. It was very intentional, and it's vastly benefited both sides, and will continue to. I mean, once again, we know that those customers want our product. We know they see us as a reliable supplier. I think the hiccup we've run into, and this really is the peril, depending on how you go with these conversations, is that the last couple of years have raised questions in their minds about us as a reliable supplier. And you can, if you're a Mexican grain buyer, you can get product from Brazil or Argentina. It's a lot more costly. The logistics are rough, but our customers went out and figured out how to do it. And every once in a while, we see a purchase, we know that price plays into that, but they're seeing what they can do. And it is such a large customer that even a small amount of market share loss is actually a huge impact on the economy, the ag economy, the US economy, and very specifically to farmers in this part of the world who have invested heavily in building that infrastructure to ensure long-term profitability for themselves.
I would add reliable buyer as well, right? I mean, on the other side. So it's just beyond mercantilism. It's are we dependable as a buyer? And so you think of the rattling your saber, and then you see your avocados going from Mexico to China, where China is gobbling as much as they can, or rattling your saber on dairy product, and then Mexico having to think of diversification because we come across as not reliable. So those are also recent costs to think about.
Right. So it's so regulatory cooperation. I mean, through FTAs, regulatory cooperation is an inherent part of that. Even if it's not written into the rules, you're creating a lot of processes that allow you to solve problems faster or eliminate the possibility of problems to begin with. And that's one of the arguments, just to bring some of the themes from today full circle. We've talked about the inability of advancing negotiations in the WTO. FTAs may allow you to go a bit further faster in some of these key areas that are important to businesses, like the standards areas. We've talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and some of the sort of tangible and intangible benefits is showing some leadership in being able to write the rules for a large swath of trade, for 40% of global trade if we were still a part of it. In USMCA, we've innovated these biotech provisions that may migrate then to other FTAs. We've also addressed some of the state-owned enterprise issues that are really more directed at China than to some extent Canada, close your ears, John, and and Mexico, but largely China. So engaging in that way through FTAs allows us to shape the rules of the road. Speaking of FTAs, and it's not a full-blown FTA, but we also talked about Japan earlier today. So let me ask you, Melissa, to start with. Is it restorative in terms of where we would have been if we'd stayed in TPP, and what are your thoughts about that?
So, the Japan agreement for U.S. agriculture is a clear good, right? It is clearly a positive for our sector, certainly in certain places, an absolute need that, we really were going to truly fall behind without this. For my specific piece of the world, feed grains, we already had 0 tariffs on feed corn. That will continue. Japan is actually our second largest corn buyer, so we have a long established kind of mature relationship with that market. There were some reductions for sorghum and barley, which we think are very helpful. We continue to do market development for that. There's still, the opportunity for the second piece of the negotiation, kind of the second harvest, if you will, we hope, related to ethanol, where, at this moment, Japan is not directly blending fuel ethanol, but they are using ETBE, which is a component, a gasoline component, oxygenate, that is now can be made legally in Japan or imported in Japan with corn-based ethanol. So there's some space there still on the ethanol for negotiation. Is it restorative? I think we will see. And I think that for our, animal agricultural friends, I think is a very important question. I think, from our perspective, one thing to consider is that, a full TPP, which we supported, versus the Japan agreement, there are lots of other countries in that TPP agreement and CPTPP now that we now don't have agreements with. We need to go do that. Vietnam is a big one. There were tariff issues there, and certainly other trade facilitation measures there that we would like to have. So we still needed to do that. And, we are very, USMCA is very important. Mexico and Canada are 2 of our largest markets. Japan is our second largest corn market. Mexico is our first largest corn market. We absolutely need to have stability in those relationships. And so both of those agreements are good things. We also need to go out and say, okay, what's the future? And where are we going to do that? And, the sooner we can get started, the sooner we can get there. And that's something that is going to be essential for our sector's growth.
Yeah. You also have grains embodied in meat, right? And so when
Exactly.
you ship more meat, that's
Right.
a benefit to the grain industry.
Yes, we actually measure, if you go to our website, which is grains.org for anyone looking at their phone, that we have a portal that translates USDA data into feed grains in all forms. So we look at it as how much corn is going overseas, for instance. We also look at how much feed grains and then what feed grains goes into. So beef, pork, ethanol, poultry, and so you can have a better, kind of more comprehensive idea of, you have direct sales, but then it's like, okay, well, what are we value adding here and then shipping overseas versus selling you the corn and you can produce your own beef. So, just fun facts. If you like websites, and can't decipher USDAs, we can't either. So we built a portal to help you with that.
Yes, you have a good one. Okay, so what you're describing is a world where we go out potentially and negotiate more agreements, because we've sort of stopped talking about with any degree of optimism what we can do in the WTO, rightly or wrongly. But there is a downside to that, right? Because from a company standpoint, from private sector standpoint, you end up with kind of a patchwork of agreements, right? So you're worried about the competitive effects of okay, EU has had a deal with Japan before we did, so they had a head start. Maybe their tariff cuts are deeper, so you're worried about that. But these agreements also have different rules in them. They have different rules of origin, which may be less of a concern for agriculture but for many other industries, a very big concern. So from an economist standpoint, does all of this sort of spaghetti bowl of agreements raise the costs for companies, raise the transaction costs, or is it in the aggregate good?
They definitely on the rules of origins, there's big potential. So the rules of origins are given. So if you satisfy a certain amount of the input coming from one area, you basically benefit from a tariff exemption, and you can enter the good can enter as being equivalent to being made within the free trade agreement. And so as countries have different rules of origin, definitely that can become complicated to determine really if you meet or not. But think of, say, the TPP. We have already 5 without Japan, but we have 6 bilateral agreements with Australia, with Chile, with Mexico and US. All those were encompassed in the TPP. So instead of creating a bigger and more complicated spaghetti bowl, in a sense, TPP was an opportunity to rationalize the spaghetti bowl and saying, okay, here for those 6 former bilateral agreements, we have here now a new set of rules or an update on the rules that simplify things. So yes, it's complicated to navigate those, but in a sense, when you look at those mega FTAs, I think there is an opportunity to also rationalize the spaghetti bowl and simplify it.
So as I'm sitting here, I will let you say whatever you want to say next, but I was thinking about a quiz for everybody as you were describing sort of the timeline.
Yeah. Pop quiz time.
All right, does anybody know how many FTAs the United States had before we entered NAFTA?
Oh boy.
I see a couple fingers over there. Yep.
Yeah, it's not.
All right. Well, you guys are cheating. You're from DC. You're policymakers. Yeah. No. Okay. So yes, 2 is the correct answer. Tell me with whom?
Israel and Canada.
Israel and Canada. That's it. Before we had NAFTA in 1994. That's not very many. And then somebody earlier today said after 2012, right? We haven't negotiated. Until now, we hadn't negotiated new deals because PPP, sorry, Darcy, was kaput. So every deal that we've just described was done under the Bush administration. So we've actually got a very sort of weird condensed history on this stuff that's very different from the perspective of many other countries. Chile, Mexico have gone out and done a lot of deals. Costa Rica, they see themselves as positioning themselves as a place for production because they're a port to the world with all of these FTAs. But we have done relatively few. Why do you think in part that we've done relatively few?
Because I think we're still, I'm from Belgium, so in Belgium we have nothing. We used to have agriculture, but now it's all paved and taken over by urban real estate. It's very dense, like Holland almost. And so in Belgium, you import half your GDP and you export half your GDP. And so, that's a no-brainer that you're born a free trade person, or a trade integrating person. And so in the US, despite being really integrated in the world market, trade is still not a small share, but still the size of the domestic market is so big. And in a sense, the domestic market has lots of economies of scale built in. It's easier. The rules are the same versus, why don't we export more dairy? We're very competitive in dairy. I think it's just, because, of course, there are distortions from ag program and farm subsidies, but we should be able to export dairy the last 20 years. Because, we have cheap feed, good infrastructure, good genetic stock, you name it. We should be just flooding world market the last 20 years with dairy. And I think we haven't done it partly because the domestic market is much easier to deal with. And so I think that's the difference. So.
Thinking about your pop quiz questions, one of the things I always like to put in presentations is we have agreements with 20 countries, right? If you look at feed grains in all forms, back to how we calculate that, half of what we sell overseas is to those 20 countries. Half to 20 countries. That's amazing. And that doesn't include Japan, which is a huge, huge buyer. So you think about why don't we have more of them? And that's definitely taking off my Grains Council hat and putting on a domestic policy hat of it's complicated. Getting these things written and getting these things passed. And I think that, the US political conversation around trade is very dynamic. I think it's a very complex topic in a society that, maybe isn't that interested in complexity some of the time. Everybody can laugh, it's okay. And I think one of the things we've learned over the last several years is that people don't know enough about trade, in general. They don't know enough about kind of the underlying economic forces that are happening and that have been developing in their own lives sort of under the radar for decades. And we look at, the conversation about agriculture is disproportionately benefited from trade, but people who engage in agriculture live in rural areas that have often been hurt on the manufacturing side. And then you talk about, 20% of manufacturing in the United States is related to agriculture, so that, that's integrated. You got to talk about technology, and just having these conversations is complicated. I think building the will to have those conversations is complicated, and that's something we certainly have got the message over the last several years, that even in agriculture, which has benefited so much from trade and is generally so supportive of trade, there is a need for kind of continued education about this, because getting into those complexities really does matter, and it's a long-term game. And I liken it more to ag research almost than talking about a farm bill or something, because it doesn't, you got to start now to have the benefit from a long time, and it's not a discrete thing. There's a lot of countries out there. It's a big world, not a lot of time. So that's something, we worked on a lot, and I really applaud forums like this for really making the effort to teach about some of these issues that are really challenging to talk about, but necessary for our economic growth.
That's right. Yeah.
Just one more point. I think we trade also as the kind of is personified as being the job destruction machine. And so you think of job churning. Actually, I read recently the U.S. labor market churns about 55 million jobs a year. And so trade is just a rounding. With my apologies, not to dismiss the tragedy of or the cost of adjustment, but trade, is only part of the picture. And so technological change in manufacturing and so the role of technical change is, in a sense, so much bigger in terms of creating dynamism and churning than trade. I think there is maybe one part of the education would be saying, here's the economics of the churning and of the labor market, and show what trade is responsible for and what are the other causes creating basically the need to adjust. So I think that would be maybe a way to, in a sense, stop demonizing trade.
Stop demonizing, yes. Yeah. Stop demonizing trade. That's right. So, I mean, that was, in your answers, you really touched on everything that we've talked about today, which is that there's a component here of, the United States over history favoring the global arena because, we wanted to create a multilateral environment in which free trade and economic freedom could thrive around the world. That was a big part of it. We have an extremely large market, so we are less reliant on trade. It means we have a lot of leverage in trade negotiations. We adhere to very high quality trade agreements. It takes us a very long time increasingly to negotiate them. It's very hard to get them through Congress once we do. So I think you touched on all of that, and it's been controversial because people worry about, they associate increased trade and increased competition with the potential for job loss. And I think we had a lot of eloquent speakers today from Ted and Darcy and others talking about the need to be proactively thinking about what the global competitive environment looks like in the future and how do we prepare American workers for that. And it's not all about trade, certainly. President Bush once said, trade shows confidence in the American worker. And I always thought that was a really great way to look at it, that it creates opportunity for American workers and we can compete. So we are at the mark where we usually open it up for Q&A, so I'm happy to identify questions for these guys to answer. I think we've got one here.
Developing countries have come up a few times throughout the day, and I'd like to dive a little deeper into the topic. The White House recently raised issue within the WTO that developing countries often fall under special and differential treatment provisions. So my question gets to be, in the context of countries like the US and China maybe not abiding by all the rules in the global trade space, where do we find the equilibrium point of mutual benefit for both developed and developing countries? Is it developing countries pursuing FTAs in which some developed countries can work on a situational basis with them, or working through these global trade bodies like the WTO, or probably more of a balance of both? And then, at what point do they switch? So how can it be a win-win for both developed and developing countries in all of this?
That's a great question.
Well, I think there are two.
I'll let him answer.
You can think of two major issues with truly not self-declared, but truly, say, think of an African country. You have extremely high trade costs. The infrastructure is not there, the roads are not there, the port facilities are substandard, and so forth. So that's one aspect, is in a sense helping developing countries getting better infrastructure and institution. And so actually the WTO with meager means does that. And so you have on trade facilitation, for instance, there are training programs and subsidized ways to help those developing countries. So that would be one way, say, through the WTO. And then, you think of a TPP agreement, you need a really strong institutional capacity. That has been mentioned several times today. And so that's the difficulty, right? I mean, so, you can put a lot of things on paper. Are you going to really enforce them? And so you need to wait for those countries to, in a sense, move up in terms of institutional capacity. And that takes time to build, right? And so there is no magic pill for that. So.
I would add kind of a third piece to that. The mission statement of my organization is developing markets, enabling trade, improving lives, right? Like we are explicitly trying to build markets for US products. We want to sell US products. But in doing that, really you have to build the pie. And, if a country is importing more grain or even just using more grain, then that is going to help us because it's a global market. Right? So there are a lot of countries, and over the since 1960, which country it is kind of depends on their development cycle. Back in the day, I mean, it was Japan and Korea, and now it's East and West Africa is where we're going into. But if you can go into a country, a good example in our history is Morocco, right? So in the 90s, we went in and really started to help them build a local poultry industry. I mean, from the ground up, knowing that this is not a short-term play. And this is not where they're going to be able to import our grain right now. But they needed basic kind of capacity. Like, how do you do this? How do you source, you know, all of the various pieces you need to have a local poultry industry? How do you build an association to go out and, you know, petition the government? We take for advantage that we have associations that can petition our government and work together as an industry to get things done. How do you build that kind of local social capacity? And over time, you know, that industry has grown. It is now, you know, well represented by an association. You know, the poultry industry is big. They're an importer. And, you know, the side benefit of that is that as that industry has grown, it has developed infrastructure that then allows for imports of value-added products from the United States. So now we're looking at, you know, Morocco's willing to take our chicken, right, because they now have cold chain. They now have storage. They now have enough consumer demand for kind of high quality product. The consumers know what that high quality product is, and there's enough of them that want it because the economy is also growing, of course. It's a virtuous cycle. That there's demand not just for our grains for the local poultry industry, but for imports. And so that is, you know, I think that's kind of the ideal market development scenario, where we say this is a win-win, not just because it sounds good, I mean it does, but because it's real, and that's sustainable demand over time. We don't want to go in and do a quick hit and have demand for a little while. I mean, that's kind of the part of the debate with China, right? It's like, do you do structural change, if that's even possible, or do you do sales? Sales are great. We obviously want sales. And I want sales 5 years from now too, and 10 years from now, and 20 years from now. And I want to know those sales are going to be there for, you know, my farmer board members' kids. That's an important part of this.
Other questions for John and Melissa?
All right, I have two questions. They're kind of interrelated, so I'm going to cheat and ask them both. My first is, right at the beginning, you guys talked about trade diversion versus trade creation. We talked a lot about China. We haven't talked a lot about the EU. So my first question is kind of broadly speaking, how long does the EU with like the common agricultural policy, which is kind of based in this idea of trade diversion, how long is that sustainable looking into the future, especially as we move towards free trade areas? And then my second question has to do with Brexit, and just like what a free trade agreement would look like, and what the specific issues, if and when Brexit occurs, like what are the specific issues that the U.S. government and the British government are going to have in terms of negotiating that beyond like the chlorinated chicken issue?
See how well I taught these guys? Look at these questions are awesome.
You know, since 1992, in a sense, the EU has been moving away from incentive at the margins and more decoupled, so-called decoupled payments. Also, it's, you know, still very high, higher than the US, but you know, both countries, I would say, up to the Uruguay round, moved in a direction where ag subsidies were much less offensive in terms of distorting market, and so both of them moved from you're an econ major, right? So you know the difference between marginal effect and inframarginal effect, and so in a sense, many of those support mechanisms went to area. In the US, we had, you know, decoupled payments, flexibility payments. Now we call them something else because we don't want, you know, politically it was not very popular, but they were doing what they were supposed to do. So you keep subsidizing the farming sector, but you do it such that at the margin, the price signals you get are much less distorted. And the EU has moved to the same mechanism. It's called area payments. And by and large, of course, you still have distortion at the border with variable levies and things like that. But by and large, the EU has been moving steadily in the same direction. Whereas in the US, we have, we have gotten, in the last farm bills, we have gotten rid of flexibility payments, and we have moved back to very distortive, I would say, non-sustainable market distorting policies like subsidizing, crop insurance to the tune of 50% and more, and we have other forms of policies that are much more coupled with production decisions. And so if anything, I think the US in the last two farm bills has been moving away from the right direction, and the EU has, although the subsidies are still high, the EU has been moving into a more sustainable form of subsidy level that doesn't distort and irk world markets. So that's the first one. In terms of Brexit, I don't know. I'm not a Brexit specialist, so it's it's our first European partner, I think, or about in terms of services, and so it would be really important to I don't know what will happen. You go back to MFN, or what would be the implication? I have no idea. I'm not. Maybe David and other people know what would happen to Brexit, but as you mentioned at the previous conference, it takes a long time to negotiate those trade agreements, and so the news will be bad news in the short term, because even if you agree on all principles and ideas, signing those agreements is going to take some time. So I think it's really bad news for the Brits, maybe not so much for the US, and we're losing one market. We still have 27 of the EU markets, but I don't know, potentially that's, I don't know what would happen there.
So just to add, I try not to get too much into the domestic policy side of things in my current role. I'm not sure I would agree with you. Certainly, the last few farm bills have moved more towards a revenue base, and the current kind of MFP situation is. We'll be having that discussion for the next several years. I'm sure my colleagues will. As far as Brexit and the EU go, I think there's a potential, if we're going to negotiate an agreement with the EU and we're going to negotiate an agreement with the UK, well, the UK may be more, I guess, open to some things the EU would not be from our perspective. What all happens there is very much to be determined, and I think until Brexit happens or doesn't happen, or they fall out or whatever, we don't really know. We have, again, because we're a market development organization and working closely with our customers, part of what we do is like flex with the times. So we've been working with customers, certainly in the EU, for just kind of marketing reasons and the way things have flowed out, especially with like sorghum, for instance, over the last several years. But with the UK to kind of see, can we help you maintain your supply here? Like, what's going to happen as far as your access to inputs that you need? So we're having those conversations on an ongoing basis, but I don't think anybody knows what that's really going to look like. But that is a key function and why it's important. We have staff all over the world, and that's one reason why, is because when events like this occur, or events like African swine fever occur, people on the ground have to shift fairly swiftly, and in so much as we can help them do that, we want to.
Okay, I think we had David over there.
Well, the question about Brexit is an interesting one, and just to add from that conversation we had the other day, that the Department of International Trade actually had asked me about some of what they were going to have to do, and in the conversation they said, well, we figure right now we think there's 753 agreements we're going to have to renegotiate.
So get in line, yeah.
No, Andre, we're CAFTA, right? I was involved in 31 rounds of negotiation in CAFTA for one agreement. So the other 752, I don't know when I'd have time for them, to be honest. But that's going to be an interesting thing for them. But my question is actually goes to do you go for the quick hit or the long game? And is the Japan agreement going to replace what was foregone with the TPP? Now, when I worked on FTAs, largely the lion's share of everything I worked on was in the intellectual property chapters. So I worked on one of those places where it was the non-tariff barriers that we were trying to harmonize. Other chapters like labor and things of that nature, where a great deal of the value, for example, in TTIP that John was talking about, would be in that long-term benefit of the harmonization of those non-tariff barriers. My question is that if we enter into these agreements where the emotional and pointed and hard-hitting, hurting things in tariffs can be traded, beef and soybeans for access to our automobile market. Well, how do you get them back to the table to eat their vegetables if they've already had dessert? How do you get the rest? Because the rest is a lot of the value. And that's my question is, how do you see us doing that? And will we actually recover what we lost in the ability to enter a broader agreement?
Well, that's not a hard question at all.
I was like, well.
I see a TPP 2.0. So I think the US is going to get its senses back and realize what a blunder it was. And so you could see, say in a few years, a TPP 2.0 where, say, US, Korea, because you look at the US-Korean agreement, actually it's very much along the lines of TPP with many of the chapters organized and the same spirit, I would say, of deep integration. And I know there are some issues with Korea and the automobile industry for TPP that would be maybe harder to negotiate, but you could see a second wave of TPP integration where the US joins, the Korea joins, and maybe a few other Latin American countries that are the level of prepared to make those integration adjustments. So that's my optimist view of the. So.
I would love to believe that. I think we'd be happy to go back to TPP. I don't think we're going to, but we'd be happy for it. And truly, what we won't get back is the time, right? I think Ambassador Yeutter spoke about that. Like we have spent several years not going in the direction we'd been going for quite a long time, and even if we snap our fingers and something magical happens and we do TPP 2.0 and it's all okay again, it's still time, and it's still there's a function of kind of what has happened in that relationship, and where has the trust that underlies all of this gone, and you can't roll back the clock, and I feel like that's something. I mean, truly, USMCA. That's the lesson from it is, again, fingers crossed, God willing, it will be passed. It will be we'll have it on the books, and there we go. We're never going to go back to our customers who have trains literally built into their facility that go to the middle of Nebraska, not wondering, is this okay to do? I don't need a plan B. They didn't need a plan B. They didn't think about a plan B. Why would they? We're never going to go back to that space. So, does that at the end of the day, 20 years down the line looking back, really hurt us? We'll find out. But there's risk there. There's risk there.
Okay. Well, with that, I don't want to keep you from hearing from Zippy Duval. I'm sorry I didn't take your question, but we're out of time. So thank you, John and Melissa, very much for that.